Materials supplied by Microsoft Corporation may be used for internal review, analysis, or research only. Any editing, reproduction, publication, rebroadcast, public showing, internet, or public display is forbidden and may violate copyright law.
Thank you for coming. My name is Deb Crawford, and I'm here to welcome David Herlihy, who is joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. David has researched the invention and early development of the bicycle and will be discussing his new book, Bicycle: A History. He is a historian and a writer. His work has been featured on NPR, in the New York Times, and several other publications. He's also the author of The Lost Cyclist, the epic tale of the American adventurer and his mysterious disappearance. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Oh, hey, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. What I'm going to show you today are photos taken in the year 1891 by two young Americans who were cycling around the world. And you see them pictured here. This was kind of their studio shot when they started the tour, taken in London in the fall of 1890. And they were riding what were known as safety bicycles, which is really the prototype of contemporary bicycles that would eventually replace the high wheelers, and you'll see a few photos of those in a minute. But so that was one of the novel aspects of this tour, was the fact that they were going to ride this type of bicycle. And another novel aspect was they bought, before they started, a pair of Kodak cameras, and they were relatively compact compared to conventional cameras of the day, and instead of using glass plates, they used film, and so they were also kind of on the state of the art from the point of view of photography as well. And something like 40 years ago, UCLA came across a collection of something like 400 of the original nitrate negatives taken by one of those Kodaks. And that's what we'll be looking at in a moment. But I want to give you a little more background first about these two. They were both Midwesterners. They graduated from Washington University in St. Louis. And they weren't cyclists until their senior year, when the safety became all the rage. And they decided as soon as they graduated that they'd go over to Liverpool, England, and buy a pair of safety bicycles. And the original idea was just to tool around the British Isles, but they had such a great time of it that they decided they would continue around the world. And in London, they made their announcement. Just to give you a little more background before we actually look at some of the photos they took, from the point of view of bicycle technology, there's really three basic phases. There's the original, what we call a bone shaker, which was introduced around the year 1867, 68. And it's curious to note that the original, one of the first cycling journals in France, called Le Vélocipède Illustré, in 1869, carried a series of articles about a certain Jonathan Shop, who was supposedly on his way around the world on a bicycle. But in fact, of course, it was fictitious, because you wouldn't want to ride that. You wouldn't get very far around the world on that. That weighed probably about 100 pounds, and a solid iron frame and wooden carriage wheels, etc. But the bicycle developed fairly rapidly. So by the 1880s, you had what some people know as the penny farthing pictured there. Whoops, that's the wrong device. This is what I want. Okay, so this thing comes along, and in some ways it might look like a regression, because the profile's a lot more intimidating than this was, but it was much better constructed. So tubes, wire wheels, solid rubber tires, and it was reasonably roadworthy. So the idea of going around the world on a bicycle was no longer the stuff of pure fantasy by the 1880s, and a gentleman named Thomas Stevens, it was credited with the first round-the-world journey, started in 1884, and he logged about 14,000 miles on 3 continents. So Allen and Sachleben began their trip about 3 years later, but they opted for the safety bike. So they had the distinction of riding the first sort of what might call a modern bicycle around the world. Shortly after they started, a gentleman named Frank Lenz also began a trip around the world on a safety, but he used pneumatic inflatable tires, so that was kind of his new spin. Now, there's actually a connection between this gentleman and Lenz in that Lenz would actually not make it home. He would disappear in Turkey, which is the subject of my other book, The Lost Cyclist, and Sachleben would be the one who'd go searching for him. So that's kind of an aside. So it was the globe girdling that would make Allen and Sachleben famous, but the other interesting aspect, though, of their trip again was the technology they were using for photographs, and that part has been relatively overlooked. So again, if you go back to the bone shaker era, photography was already about 20 years old at that point, but originally it was daguerreotypes and it was one-off images, and by the 1860s they were using glass plates, glass negatives, so that you could reproduce the images on paper, and that really brought down the cost and popularized the photography. So of course it was very natural to think, well, why not, give a photographer a bicycle and then they could go ride around and take photos wherever they want. So that idea was immediately apparent, but again, the technology really precluded that because, first of all, the bike was still very crude, but also photography, they were using something called the wet process, which meant that you had to have a portable darkroom. You had to prepare the glass plates with chemicals, and then 10 minutes later take your expose it, and then go back in the darkroom and develop it. So you would have to carry a small laboratory and a portable darkroom on this kind of bike. So the idea was there, but it wasn't very practical. But again, when you get to the high wheel era, the idea of a cycle photographer really was possible, though not necessarily easy, because again, this was a rather precarious vehicle, as you can imagine. It had the tendency to flip over, and you could suffer what was called the header. So first of all, you had to be bold enough to ride one of these things, and you had to carry a fair amount of hardware with the glass plate. So the dry process did simplify things. So at that point, you no longer had to prepare the glass plates before exposing them, nor did you have to develop them right away. So it was theoretically possible to be a cycle photographer, as Frank Lenz would be, and I'll show you some of his work as well. But what Allen and Sachleben did was they combined this technology with the new Kodak, and so they really showed for the first time how it was to be almost, at that point, anyone really could be a cycle photographer. You didn't have to be an expert cyclist to ride this, and you didn't have to be an accomplished amateur photographer to use a Kodak. And you could also take snapshots, so spontaneous pictures, rather than kind of the more staged variety. So it really opened up a whole new era of cycle photography. So again, what made these guys famous was their trip around the world. This is a letter of introduction. When the last leg of Allen and Sachleben's world tour was crossing the United States in early 1893, and this was a letter. They were on their 4th set of bicycles at that point, and Victor was the maker, and the agent in San Francisco provided them with this little letter of introduction, which mentions, the famous world journey and so forth. But again, it's really photography that we're focusing on here. So again, this image of a tricycle dates from 1869. So you could see that this is what, again, the wet process. So the inventor had to conceive of a portable darkroom plus enough space to carry all the chemicals. Again, not a very practical idea. But here's our Frank Lenz. He becomes one of the earliest accomplished cycle photographers on his high wheeler. He was clever enough he devised a method of taking photos in motion, which was rather tricky. He had a little, so he'd set his camera up, which was a big boxy affair like this, and he attached a hose with a bulb at the end of it, and in such a way that when he rode over, he put the bulb on the road, and when he rode his tire over that, that would take the photo. So he'd know when to tip his cap. So he was definitely on the cutting edge, and you could see he was from Pittsburgh. A local newspaper spotted him with his gear and made remarks about how bulky the equipment was, but nevertheless, Lenz appears to be hardy enough to lug all that around. So I'm going to show you some of his photos just to give you and before we get to the Allen and Sachleben ones. So it gives you an idea of, you can kind of compare. Arguably Lenz's photos are as nice or nicer, but again, think of, what he has to haul around to do it. So these are scenes from around Pittsburgh in the 1880s during the high wheel era. You can notice the roads weren't particularly good either. It's one of my favorite shots in Washington, Pennsylvania. Again, that's Lenz taking his own photo, using glass plates. And more, he would be touring. He toured with a buddy, made several trips along. That's our national road. That was a superhighway back in 1890. That's in Indiana, I think, and Cleveland. So again, they are slightly posed. He had to do a certain amount of setup before taking the photo. Again, here they are with his buddy in Illinois this time, 1890. And another view near Pittsburgh. So, you get the idea of the sort of photos that he was taking in the late 1880s, early 1890. Again, the National Road in New Concord, Ohio, which was the birthplace of astronaut John Glenn, although it seems a long way from the space age there. Again, that's Lenz looking at surveying the road over the Appalachians. So when Lenz took off on his world tour, he did switch to the safety bicycle because he wasn't going to get a sponsor to ride the old-fashioned high-wheeler. But he kept a kind of conventional, this camera here in the case, it did use film, so he did switch from glass plates to film, but it was still a very boxy affair. So it was still not exactly a practical photo setup. Now, getting back to Allen and Sachleben, so what they bought when they got to London was this little camera, the Kodak, which had been on the market for about 3 years. So I think it was actually a Model 2, and you can see their slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." So it's a lot smaller than the conventional cameras, and the fact that it uses film makes it a lot lighter. So you can see how it's much better suited, in theory, for cycle touring. So what they didn't tell you, though, is that when you were done with, I think you could get up to 100 exposures, you were supposed to send the camera back to the factory and they would reload your film. So it wasn't quite as practical as they make it sound, but still an advance over the previous models. So they started after Allen and Sachleben left London in the fall of 1890, they pedaled across France and Italy, and initially they corresponded with a paper in London, and they would send their negatives back, and the paper republished it, but the quality is not particularly good. And unfortunately, the collection, the UCLA collection, doesn't include the negatives that they took going across Europe. We don't know what happened to those. So we have some idea based on the ones that were published what their European photos look like, but we have very few of them. But now, starting, so they got to Greece, to Athens, at the end of 1890, and then they decided to stay there for the winter while they planned their trip around the world. They had to get across Asia. So this is where the UCLA negative, where their collection of negatives start. And they were just scanned like a few weeks ago, so nobody's really seen these images in at least 120 years, or very few people anyway. So you can see the quality is a whole lot better when you scan it from the original nitrate negative. But that's a very delicate process, by the way, because they would learn over time that the original film was highly combustible, and it got worse with time. So today, if you have a collection of these, they need to go into special storage, and to get them scanned is a big process. You've got to get a special van to take them to a special lab and special equipment and so forth. But you can see the quality actually does come out it's quite impressive. So here they are in the Acropolis. And each of these negatives was in a little envelope, and Sachleben wrote copious notes, so we have a good idea about who's in the photo and when they were taken. So this is a guard at the Acropolis who initially refused to let them in with their bicycles, but when they offered to teach him how to ride, he relented. So again, more shots here of... do you think we should dim the lights, or I just wonder if that would improve the image at all? Yeah, I think that's better, huh? Let me just backtrack a sec so you might get better views of those. Okay, so here again, looking down at from the Acropolis, racing at the Acropolis. So you can see these are not these are really snapshots. There's not a lot of thought put into it. They're pretty spontaneous, basically. So this is a photo of they're in costume. It's the Greek New Year's in 1891. So they got dressed in traditional costumes, but they rode their bicycles around Athens. And this is this was our ambassador at the time, the American ambassador in Athens, a fellow named Snowden. I don't know if he's related to the current Snowden in the news. But that's his son, who, like a lot of young people at the time, was getting increasingly interested. So as the cycling world transitioned from that high-wheel bicycle to the safety, more and more people, including women, started to get interested in, it started to seem like something a lot more feasible. In fact, so here we have the consul's daughter. This is the American consul in Athens, and this is his daughter. So she actually didn't know how to ride, but nevertheless, she was very interested in cycling and posed for Sachleben. And we know, so I'll tell you a little bit, as an aside, kind of the story of how, sort of interesting story about how these negatives came to UCLA in the first place. And so it seems that sometime in the 60s, workmen were cleaning out a house in Houston, and we believe that was Sachleben's residence. He died in 1953. For many years, he would manage a theater in Houston. So apparently some relatives decided it was time to get rid of Uncle Will's stuff, and workmen were like dropping boxes of his old papers from the third floor window into a backyard bonfire. And apparently one of the boxes missed the target and exploded on the lawn. and somebody who just happened to be driving by noticed, a bunch of old papers and photos, and stopped the car, got out, and offered to take that off their hands. And that's what's now known as the Sachleben collection at UCLA. And unfortunately, it makes you think that might have been where the European and also the China photos, which we don't have the negatives from their ride across China either, so that may be where they wound up. But we also, one of the things that was rescued was a diary that Sachleben kept in Athens. So we know quite a bit we know that he had a huge crush on this young lady. I tracked down her grandchildren and sent them this photo, and they were quite pleased to have that. Here's another kind of snapshot street scene of Athens. That, of course, is one of their bicycles, because bicycles that were not really in use in Athens at this point. I mean, they were basically the only cyclists in Athens. I think if you notice carefully, you see the little child peeking out, smiling. I think that's kind of a fun photo. Again, the ability to take spontaneous images, you can see that in these photos. So they just happened to pass by the Queen coming out of a service, so they photographed the Queen of Greece getting into her royal carriage here. I like this photo too. So if you look, you might see Sachleben there. You can see his front wheel there, and he's grinning at the end of this human corridor. And what's happening is that Alan, his buddy, is cycling down this corridor and taking the photo. So you can see the expressions on the face of people who aren't used to seeing cyclists. So I think they were kind of amazed, blown away by both the bicycle and the camera. Both technologies were new to most locals anyway. Here's that kind of tribute to the bicycle and on a pedestal. Oh, and this is a kind of a fun scene. Again, thanks to the diary, we know a lot of the backstory. So this is Alan. So at a certain point, this bicycle was one of the two we saw in that photo in the studio in London. So that was actually already their second pair of bicycles. The first pair they discarded after touring the British Isles, and they basically got a London manufacturer. This was called the minnehaha, to give them two of his bicycles as kind of a sponsorship. But by the time they got to Greece, they realized that they were way too fragile to try to, bicycle across Asia. So they decided that Alan had to go back to London and pick up a pair of sturdier bicycles. And so here they are at the train station. He's about to catch his train. But these guys were starting to become celebrities of sorts, and they were concerned. Alan was concerned. He didn't want to be recognized on a train going to London, because that didn't really fit with the image of a cycling globetrotter. So he donned a disguise, which is what you see here, the top hat. The cane's he's got a cane. So he borrowed. We also know who these characters were thanks to the diary. This was an Armenian radical who had just been tossed out of Turkey for causing trouble. And this was the son of a very wealthy Greek shipping magnate. And he had actually already ordered some bicycles from England before he met Alan and Sachleben. He happened to see them at a cafe in Athens with their bicycles, and he approached them because he didn't know how to ride his own bicycle, so he got them to become his cycle teachers. And he's the one who loaned the elements of that disguise there to Alan. Okay, so now we'll move through Turkey a little, show you a few scenes of Turkey. This is when they decided, the winter's over. In the spring of 1891, they start their ride across Asia. But first they stop in Constantinople, now Istanbul, for a month or two to continue to work out some of the details. So this is Sachleben crossing the bridge between Para and Istanbul. And you can see he's getting a few looks here. And here's, so these are now the Humber bicycles. When Alan came back with a couple of Humber bicycles, which were a lot sturdier, and those two bicycles, this one included, actually survived. So one is owned by the London Science Museum, and the other one is owned by the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. And that, of course, is Hagia Sophia in the background. Again, you can sort of see the attention. It's not clear sometimes if it's the camera or the bicycle that's drawing such interesting looks. We can get a sense of the roads at the time from this photo. And this was the family. So they stayed with an Armenian doctor. Now, after they returned to the United States, they wrote a book, Alan Stockleben, called Across Asia on a Bicycle. So they didn't describe any of their adventures in Europe. They just started the story here. The opening paragraph describes the 12-year-old son of the doctor escorting them to the Bosphorus. So here now we know what he looked like thanks to this. And this gives you a sense of some of the roads, some of the desolation crossing Turkey. So everybody advised them not to go across Turkey, but they were keen on adventure. So I like this photo too. So they were compelled, the authorities would generally compel them to hire armed guards on horseback, which the cyclists really didn't want because they'd have to tip them at the end of the day, but occasionally they would actually outsprint them at the end of the day so as not to have to pay them. But they did occasionally come in handy, helping them get across these swollen streams. That's Will taking a bath. There's a nice view of his equipment. Another scene, get a sense of what the traffic was like. And he seems to be checking out his tire there. Again, these are the guards on horseback that they were compelled to hire. And there's a view of somewhere in Turkey, some kind of volcanic area, I think. And that looks like a pretty tough mule path. I think even with a modern day mountain bike, you'd have a hard time with that. And again, there's not a whole lot of, you kind of wonder where if you got hungry there, where you would go. So again, they would often, when they stopped in little towns, they'd stay at inns. They'd have to meet with the authorities and announce their presence. Of course, there was really no need for that because the whole town would spot them and surround them, and they would be hounded to give cycling demonstrations. So they'd have to do that every evening. And so they've just done one here. I think that's the local. That's the local chief, I guess, and that's his son, I believe. Okay, so now we'll move and see a few scenes from Persia.
Question?
Yep.
Do you know how much these bikes weighed, and how many days could they be away from a town with the little bit of luggage they were carrying?
Well, okay, the bikes, so the original mini ha-has were pretty light. I think they were something like 26 pounds, which proved to be too light. I believe these Humbers were more like 40 pounds, which is certainly very heavy by today's standards. There's also no gears, and they were using what were known as cushion tires, so they're not actually inflated. They're just a tube, a squishy tube. I don't think they did much more than 50 miles a day. But they would usually come across, I think occasionally they did have to sleep outside, but they were generally able to find at least an inn where they could stay for the night. Again, another scene of them stopping and probably cooling off because at this point, they had to deal with temperatures that reached as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. More images from Persia, some of the buildings they saw. This gentleman is an American missionary in Tabriz, Persia. Whipple, his name was, and he's, we know from the inscription that he's having a conversation with 3 beggar women. They, according to Sachleben, they're asking for alms, and it doesn't look like they're getting very far with Mr. Whipple. Here's a shot of the family. So they would often, Alan and Sachleben would often stay with missionary families along the way, because that way, they'd get some of the comforts of, Western comforts that they were used to. Also, they could get advice from the missionaries who knew the area well about where to go, what roads to take, that sort of thing. This fellow, Alan Whipple, actually grew up to become a very famous surgeon. Invented something called the Whipple process, or the Whipple system, or something to do with the pancreas in the 50s, I believe. They would also occasionally stop at telegraph stations. This is a German telegraph operator and his family. So, if they could find a Western host, they would usually stay there. Otherwise, they'd have to go to a local inn. And they would, occasionally have some confrontations with the locals. I think Alan described one night when people were so curious to see these guys and their belongings that they were climbing on the roof of the inn, trying to force their way into their room. There's a view of, I think that's a private mosque. And it's the ruins of an ancient bridge. So the final stretch of the photos cover their journey across today's Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So here are some scenes. Again, usually you see photos of the bikes, and they're, I think, with local authorities. So the governor, when they got to Ashgabat, I think it's called, he insisted that the cyclists take this. This was just opened, the Trans-Caspian Railway. So he insisted that they take that for 400 miles to avoid a desert, and they reluctantly agreed to do that. So that's the train. This is a madrasa, a religious school, and that's the Sachleben's silhouette. Seems to be carrying on a conversation, a deep conversation with somebody. Again, this would be, I think, the palace of one of the governors. A Russian church. And again, scenes from the city. And I'm not sure what these two are up to, but they've got some kind of a wheel, it looks like, grinding machine. And again, that would be a Russian officer, and that's probably his residence there. Here they're coming across, they took a ferry across the river. They're probably the first people to bring bikes on, I would guess. So again, they'd spend the second winter in Tashkent, and that's where, unfortunately, the photo collection ends. So the next spring of 1892, they would cross China, across the Gobi Desert. And unfortunately, we don't have the negatives of the photos they took. But we do have one photo from showing them in China, taken by this gentleman who wanted to be, the photographer wanted to be in the picture. So he set it up and then jumped into it. And so this is nearing the end when they were getting to, nearing Beijing. And this, I think, this was basically something that a local, it's an announcement. I think that it explains to the locals that not to hurt them, basically. Let's see. Well, and here it gives you the date, October of 1892, and the location. So when they got to the United States for the last leg, again, I mentioned they got their fourth set of wheels at that point. They discarded the Humbers and they got the Victors, this time with inflatable tires. And it's not too many. I don't think they used their Kodaks at that point, and we don't have very many photos of them in the United States. I just found this one in Los Angeles. That's Sachtleben, and there's Alan, and they're being escorted around by the Los Angeles Bicycle Club. So finally, here we see Sachtleben again. So 4 years after this journey, so they returned home in 1893, and 2 years after that, Sachtleben made a return visit to Turkey, but this time his mission was to find whatever happened to the missing cyclist Frank Lenz. So here we have one photo which looks a little bit staged, but this is the missionary, the Canadian missionary who hosted Sachtleben. He went to the town in Turkey nearest to where Lenz had disappeared, and so you see the missionary here interviewing the locals, asking if they've know anything about this lost cyclist, and there's Sachtleben taking notes. So apparently the UCLA collection, not all the negatives have been scanned, and it appears that there are some which relate to his second journey to Turkey, but we haven't seen those yet, so it'll be interesting to see what those entail. But I think what has come out of the UCLA collection is already quite extraordinary. I mean, just to basically have this kind of album of a year on the road in 1891 is pretty remarkable. So I could take any questions if yes.
I noticed some of your plates appear to have some numbering or identification, but it looks as though if these were slides, they were mounted backwards. Were they scanned backwards?
Oh, which you're talking about the round ones, or?
If you go back to anyone with a number in the upper left, like
all
the digits.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Which means facial features are switched and whatnot.
Huh.
Or you can think about that later.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's kind of how how UCLA gave it to me. But that would be a question to ask them if. Slides
that have writing in them that you can tell if the actual slide is.
Oh well, let's see. I wonder. You think they might all be reversed? Huh. What about here?
See on the train there? Yeah, that's right.
It's hard to see. We'd have to zoom in, maybe.
It says number 41 on it. It's right side forward. So probably the person who wrote on it with the slide turned opposite, and then it was turned right side when it was scanned with modern equipment.
That sounds plausible to me.
Probably when you shine the light through it anyway, like when comparing it with the slide projector versus a scanner, would the orientation be such that if you were trying to flip through the slides and then stick one in the machine, it might make more sense to write it in that orientation.
Actually, they may have etched the emulsion. Rather than, it may not have been a pen, it may have been like a pin, because it's white writing on black emulsion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know who's. I mean, maybe that. I don't know if that's Sachtleben himself writing notes or.
So I have a question. How did their daily distance compare to other modalities of travel on those types of roads at the time? For example, comparing to horse or anything like that.
I think they could pretty much outdo the horses. They could do, I think, on the average 50 miles a day, and that's a lot, I think, on a horse. I mean.
So that's basically why they were able to find food and water and accommodations, because other modalities of travel at that time
were no faster than theirs. No, that's true. Yeah, and this was the old caravan road that they were on. So although as we could see, it was desolate in many places. Nevertheless, there were stops along the way. That would be probably every 50 miles. Yeah, so I don't think they ever really got stranded. Yes?
So modern bicycles occasionally break down. Chains break, tires come off rims. These didn't have clincher tires. They were like glued or sewed onto rims. If they had any kind of a mechanical issue in the middle of nowhere, there were no bicycle mechanics around.
That's true.
How did they deal with those kinds of problems?
Well, they would have to, so I can give you an example actually. So Alan's bicycle I mentioned is at the London Science Museum, and at a certain point in China the top tube broke, and you can still see today that there's telegraph wire wrapped around it. And I actually, after my book came out, I was contacted by a relative of Sachleben's who had some papers she wanted to show me, and one of the things she had was a letter written by a missionary wife in China who had just hosted these two. And in that letter she describes how her husband helped them repair the bicycle by finding a blacksmith who could wrap the wire around it. So yeah, there were definitely issues like that. I think they had to be pretty resourceful. And you know, Lenz had the additional problem in that, you know, he had inner tubes, so and you couldn't pick those up very easily. He actually shipped a trunk ahead of himself filled with additional spare parts. I don't know that Alan and Sachleben did, but no, that was I think one of the things that when they got to Tashkent, I think they did order parts, spare parts from London while they were waiting out the winter. So yeah, that was definitely a concern, breakdowns. So they had to be improvised, I think. Yes?
It surprised me when you said that a bunch of pictures were basically being discarded with a bunch of boxes. Do you have any idea how they went from a pretty significant historical event to being, okay, well, we have a bunch of some random stuff shoved in a closet somewhere that we're going to get rid of?
You know, I think part of that might have to do with the fact that, I mean, you know, so all of this trip really helped to spark what's known as the Great Bicycle Boom. I mean, so these guys were kind of evangelists promoting the new safety bike, and they had a role, I think. And so in the mid-1890s, you had this huge boom, you know, which finally cycling became something anyone could do, really, and women got interested in. And so there was a sort of heyday of the bicycle, golden era. But that kind of faded pretty abruptly by the end of the 19th century. And then when the automobile came along, I think, you know, the relatives probably thought, you know, oh, Uncle Will, you know, maybe it struck them as almost foolish that someone would bike around the world. And, you know, it's like, who needs this stuff? I mean, you know, it is kind of astonishing that somebody wouldn't have thought, well, maybe we should hang on to this stuff. But I guess we can be thankful that the whole thing wasn't lost. And, you know, I don't know that all the other negatives were lost, but, I mean, maybe they will turn up somewhere. But, well, there was Alan's camera. I don't know what happened to his negatives. So, unfortunately, I think over time, maybe people lost interest, and it just didn't seem all that important. Yes?
So, during this 1890s boom of cycling, what was the relative cost of a bicycle at that time to a horse or something else? And like, do you have any data on per capita? How many people own horses or bikes?
Well, okay, so...
Like, is it totally an upper class privileged people got them? Or?
Well, it was in the high wheel era. So yeah, they cost over $100, which was a lot of money back then. I mean, I think workmen might have, I think that might have represented at least a couple months' salary at the time for most people. And plus it was elitist anyway. I mean, the high wheel wasn't something, it was really purely recreational. So when the safety bike came along, the price didn't really, initially it was at least as expensive and even a little more because there's more hardware on it. But the fact that it was so appealing, I think, and so many, you know, so factories started to sprout up everywhere, and I think something like several million were made during the peak a year in the United States. So that helped to create like a used market. So even though it was still pretty pricey during the boom, it was already becoming popularized. And after the boom, when during the bust, then the price really plummeted. So in the early part of the 20th century, bikes became very affordable. But I think you're already seeing a transition in this period from kind of an elite vehicle to a popular vehicle. Yes?
What did these gentlemen do, or who were their parents and they could afford to take 3 years off after college?
Well, tuition wasn't what it was what it is today. Okay, so Sachleben's dad was a clothier, I think is the term. So he sold suits and things like that in a little town called Alton, Illinois, just north of St. Louis. And I guess he made a pretty good living. Alan's dad, I think, was a county judge. So they did come from fairly wealthy families, not obscenely wealthy. But, it seems like they weren't really in need of sponsorship. So, in London, they did set up, the correspondence with a paper called the Penny Illustrated Press. I think they probably got their Kodaks for free. They visited the Kodak offices. They got to deal with the 2 Minnehaha bicycles. So, but when pretty much all their arrangements fell through at a certain point, they stopped corresponding. They got tired of the editor. They had some kind of falling out, and they ditched their Minnehahas. But they kept the Kodaks. But I don't think they really needed the sponsorship. So that's why they actually weren't all that well known in this country until they arrived on the West Coast. Because they weren't, unlike Lenz, who was corresponding with a magazine, Outing Magazine, these guys were pretty much free agents, and they weren't really discovered by the American media until they had already crossed Asia and they arrived on the West Coast, and then they became real celebrities. Yep.
So after 15,000 miles of riding, did they had obviously they were fairly fit, but around the time they end their journey, I guess bicycle racing kind of started. Did they ever take interest in the athletic side of?
Yeah, well, I think Alan really wasn't all that athletic. I think he kind of just, Alan, or Sachleben was kind of like his big brother, and he just kind of followed him around. But Sachleben, I think, actually was pretty athletic, and he did participate in races when he got back to St. Louis. Doesn't seem to have done all that well, but nevertheless, I think he had some interest in racing. They were both celebrities, but neither one went on for a career in racing. I don't know if they had that level of ability. Certainly there were quite a few famous racers in the 1890s who were more or less their age. People like Major Taylor and, yeah.
Do you have an idea what gear they carried with them? It seems really minimal, like way less than I'd take for this kind of trip.
I think, yeah, they didn't have, now they had maybe one change of clothing, some tools. Let's see, they had some lubricants for the chain. They would carry some, they did have some food that they'd carry with them. I think, I'm not sure what exactly, like bread, pita bread kind of thing. But overall, I don't think they were carrying more than, say, 20 pounds. Especially when they got to the Gobi Desert, then they really had to pare down to a minimum. I think they even ditched one of their 2 cameras at that point to really be absolutely at the minimum. But yeah, I think it varied, but between, say, 20 up to 30 pounds maybe. I think they did have a cover with them. So if they did get stranded and they had to sleep, in the desert, they'd have something. But yeah, it was pretty minimal. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and if anyone needs a book, I'll be happy to